Hey.
How did you like waking up to the sound of all that rain this morning?
Oh, so good.
It was like a very nice, peaceful morning. A little overcast, kind of a fall rain. Just sets things in good order.
Hello and welcome to the Resilient Lineage podcast, where we reflect on the past, anticipate the future, and discover what God is up to today. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Milo.
And we love rain.
So the cat woke me up this morning at 5 in the morning, which was awesome. Typically, the cat likes to be up between 4:30 and 5 and wants to go out. And typically, your mom will be the one to get up and go let the cat out. Because most mornings she sleeps in later than I do. And so it gives her a chance to come back, get back to bed. This morning, I got up to let the cat out and around 5 and then just couldn't go back to bed. So I was up having my devotions when all the rain started and things. And so it was relaxing, though. It was very peaceful. It's kind of like one of those mornings, like the first fall rain. Do you know what? Even though it's not fall yet, but it felt like that. Atmosphere felt like that.
Well, this reminds me of Oregon.
Yeah.
Because like Virginia doesn't rain a ton, and if it does, it's like rains for like 5 minutes really hard, and it like goes away, and it's just
it kind of
humid.
had that like northwest steady rain. Yeah, that's true.
That's not what we're talking about this morning, though.
No, it never. The thing we talk about is like never the thing we end up talking about.
We always give you like false hope.
Like hopefully, the thing we end up talking about is
more beneficial.
Yeah, hopefully. So Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9.
Don't we read it?
Sure.
Okay. It says, "Only be careful and watch yourself closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them."
So the context around this is God has delivered his law to the people of Israel, what his expectations are for them and how he wants them to live. And how, they've seen God do incredible things. They've seen God, release them from Egypt. Yeah. They've seen, he's part of the Red Sea for them. He's provided for them along the journey. So God has done all of these incredible and amazing things, which what I find fascinating, there's a handful of things about this little passage. But he says, only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget. I'm rather amazed at how easy it is to forget God's faithfulness. Do you know what I mean? Like right now, your mom is, she for years she's held on to like this stack of calendars, and recently she started going back through them and kind of making a digital copy of everything that's in them.
This is when calendars were popular.
Yeah, this is when it's December. Get your annual calendar out and you hang it up in the kitchen.
Gift.
Yeah,
from like 1998 to like 2010.
Oh man, I think it's funny. You think that's funny? Like it's from a bygone era.
It's vintage.
It's vintage. But your mom was really good at like writing things into the family calendar and sort of tracking what was going on. And so she's been kind of capturing everything from like people that we hosted in our house, because we had like guest books and we had like all of these like times when we've had like did weddings or baptisms or trips we took, whether it was related for church ministry stuff or family vacations. Anyway, she's been capturing all of this. And as she's going through this process, one of the things she'll be like, "Hey, do you remember when?" And I'll be like, I do not remember that at all. Or like the other day, she's like, "Hey, who's so-and-so?" And I was like, "Oh, that's this person." And I hadn't thought about them in forever. So it's a really interesting, but she's going through this process of capturing these things that have been in our past. And, in some ways, that's the challenge that's laid out in this passage of scripture, is that you're going to have to do things to intentionally remind yourself of God's faithfulness, of God's provision, of what God's expectations are for you. This line of like, don't forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your hearts as long as you live, right? These things like want to fade over time, which everything wants to fade over time,
right.
Because just the wear and tear of time and the elements and a variety of things just kind of want to constantly push things into the background, and then we live with the urgent. And one of the things that I think is if somebody's living with discouragement or disappointment or anxiety, is taking the time to kind of remember, to go back and go, all right, how has the Lord been faithful? So what we want to look at today is considering who the people are that can help you watch yourself closely. Specifically, 3 roles or 3 types of people that can help with dynamic growth. Now, where's this material coming from, kiddo?
An essay.
Yeah, an essay I had to write for school. So this is one of those.
It's fresh.
It's very fresh. I anticipate that over the next, I don't know how many podcasts, as you're going to school and learning things, you even have sketched out ideas for future podcasts.
I'll just like open a note and write a line, and Dad's like, "Okay, what do you want me to do with this?" I'm like, "I don't know, but we're gonna do something with it."
We have a shared folder in Apple Notes where we can see each other's like ideas that we're generating, and we'll plop in different notes. This came from a note that I had to write a paper on the threefold offices of Christ as it relates to leadership. And so as we were thinking about it for this podcast, what we thought we'd do is look at the threefold offices as it relates to voices in our lives that we need to have to help kind of ensure we're in that place of dynamic growth in our walk with the Lord. That these are those voices that are going to help us not forget. These are those voices that are not going to let the things that the Lord has done or the things that the Lord is about fade from our lives. And so just kind of real, broadly, the role of prophet, priest, and king is one that's attributed to Christ, right? Christ was all 3 of those things. But we see those 3 roles, particularly in the Old Testament, as sort of roles God used to keep Israel in bounds. In a variety of, and if people
like a framework.
Yeah, framework. And if people were failing in those roles, then Israel was probably not in a good place.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes we're introduced to people either because they had to be that voice that was calling Israel to not forget to, what they were supposed to be about or the type of people they were supposed to be. Or they were a people that those roles, they failed in that capacity. They failed to be the priest they were supposed to be, the king they were supposed to be, the prophet they were supposed to be. And so we kind of get those 2 examples throughout Scripture. We're not going to go into details of all those things for the purposes of today. But just kind of generally, before we dive into the details of this, what are your what was your thoughts as you were reading through these notes? Like high level, what was your initial reaction?
Well, okay. When I first read it, I was like, okay, how do I identify these people with people in my own life?
Okay.
Like you can kind of just see the prophet, priest, and king. It's like literally, have I ever met a prophet? I don't know. Have I literally met a king? I don't know. And it's kind of like walking through the definitions of those things that will expand my view on that, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where it's just like literally, I've never met a king. Like, you know what I mean? But it's like, okay, Lord, who have you put in my life
that could fill that role?
That could fill that role, whether I've met them or not.
Yeah.
And then how do I look for them?
Yeah.
Or how do I put myself in a place where they see me and know they'll walk in that role?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think there's also a place where, and we're going to get into this. What does it look like to pull these folks into our lives? But first of all, let's kind of talk about some of the problems, right, that I think this will address. So in our lives, where there should be hope, right?
Right.
We oftentimes see despair.
Mm-hmm.
Where there should be intimacy, we find isolation. Where there should be order, we find chaos. Where there should be, these things in life that, like, in our hearts and in our imaginations, we think that it's not supposed to be like this. It's supposed to be something better, like whatever those things are, right? That's the kind of the role of the prophet, priest, and king speaks to those areas. Hey, you are designed to be in intimate relationships. Great. Well, then why can't I make any friends? Or why do I feel alone? Why do I feel whatever? Okay, so with that, what we're going to look at is what the role of these voices are in our lives. And this is obviously, we have show notes for every episode. I'm going to list all of the sources I'm not going to reference all of them in the text or in this podcast. But there's some books and some articles and a variety of other things that I read for this that we'll kind of lay out here. But the first rule, do you want to read that to us, kiddo?
First rule, the prophet is a voice that disrupts my life. So the prophet disrupts our lives by offering a compelling vision of who God is and how we ought to live. So,
like with that, what do you think would be an example of that?
I'd say, like, as a teen or a young adult woman, I was going to say teenage girl, but, I'm going to elevate my game a little bit.
There you go.
Young woman. I would say kind of like a youth pastor.
Okay.
Or like that kind of... He's like not the pastor of a church where he has like this, he's honed in on a very specific group of people, young adults, of this is who God is and this is how you ought to live.
Yeah.
So, like when I first read that, I was like,
that's what
youth pastors over the years too. It's not like a specific one, but ones that have spoke to me as I've grown up in my faith, versus, like a pastor that speaks over a whole congregation. It's a youth pastor speaking to me, because I feel like youth pastors, especially with students, have a more direct relationship than pastors do with a lot of people in their congregation, depending on the size and where you are. There's a variety of factors.
Yeah.
But typically, in all the youth groups I've been in, I've always had a relationship with the youth pastor in some capacity. So
so I think for me, when I was thinking about this, I think the prophet could be a voice. The emphasis is here on, it's kind of that voice that disrupts my life. Not like not in a way that brings, not disruption for disruption's sake, but kind of that voice that, like, one of the things we lay out here is that when times are good, the prophet reminds us of the false securities that comfort brings and how they can lure us to forgo our love, devotion, and obedience to God. And when I think about it, like, there's some, in fact, I was working on a paper this morning, and I was rereading some stuff from A.W. Tozer, Knowledge of the Holy. And in some ways, I think when I read Tozer he disrupts my life. Do you know what I mean? Of like, hey, don't think in these sort of ways. Or you've been thinking in these sort of ways, and it's because you want to stay comfortable. You want to stay validated in some of the decisions that you're making. I was listening to a YouTube sermon this morning of somebody that, like, theologically, I don't know if I would agree with on a lot of things, but there was a particular sermon that I wanted to listen to of theirs, and as I was listening to it, I was like, they're making some really good points that I typically don't think about because I don't want to think about those things. Because it might require me to change the way I live.
Do you know who else is a prophet in my life?
Who?
You.
Oh, yeah?
You're just going down the list. This is my dad and like every...
Because I bring disruption.
Yes. I'd be like, Dad, I had this really cool idea. He's like, let's disrupt that real quick. I'm just kidding. Let's get into it.
Crusher of dreams? I didn't see that in the description.
Okay. No, you don't crush my dreams. You just He can humble me really quick.
Well, that's enough.
No, but that's also like a parental role. Like,
yeah, I think,
and I think like that fits in.
Yeah,
because we have this really, you know me. I've lived in your house my whole life.
Yeah. Well, I think too, because prophets carry that sense of they have a vision, right? They, we often, when we read, particularly in the scriptures, when we read a prophet, they've had a vision from the Lord about how life is going to be or how it should be, or, like Daniel interpreting dreams. Like there's a vision that explains how life should be or how it's going to be based upon God's warning or decrees, right? So in light of that, there's a sort of reality that I think prophets, through their imaginations that they live with, about how things are, like, this is what's possible. This is what could be. Or you continue in those behaviors. This is the destruction that awaits, right? Here, this is the horrible things that will be in your life if you continue down this course of action. And so really, if you think about who are those folks that live with a vision that they're constantly able to articulate, and there's probably always some measure of both things, right? They're not only wanting to disrupt how comfortable life is, but when things are difficult and you're going through something that's trying, or you're going through some measure of sorrow or grief, they're also the voice that comes along and says, there's more to life than just this. There's more that the Lord is doing than perhaps what you can even see right now. That there's a future he has for you. There's a redemptive work that he is doing in all of this. Don't lose sight of that, kingdom of God, even amidst your disappointments and your sorrow. So it's not just that it's disruptive for negative reasons,
right?
But it also disruptive for positive reasons. To come alongside and say, like, hey, I know you're discouraged, I know you're frustrated, and I know you're disappointed. I know whatever those negative feelings are. I know you're in that place, but I want you to. But remember, there's something else that the Lord has for you, and in that kind of, it's sort of like the John the Baptist. Like, you're in this bad situation, right? You're mindful and aware of your sin, or you're mindful and aware of your wounds and your disappointments, but there's one coming who's greater than I. Do you know what I mean? There's this, hey, remember that there's something greater that the Lord has in store for you. Yeah. One other thing too is, and I think this becomes a very generational thing for the times that we live in, that the prophets have the ability to speak through the noise of whatever that kind of generation is attuned to. That's why I'm always fascinated by how there always seems to be, in each generation, there always seems to be a voice that kind of rises up that is able to articulate things that a generation can really latch onto. And people go, yes. Like the way they frame it, their vantage point, that kind of cuts through the cultural noise in a very divine way that sort of compels me to respond. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's like that's what I find, like when I watch Billy Graham, I think he's a phenomenal preacher, but it doesn't resonate with me as much as I think it resonated with the previous generation.
Like speaks to the times rather than
Yeah. So who do you think that is today?
Okay, well, let me just say this real quick.
You're touching the mic.
Oh, sorry. So in my intro to Bible class, we were kind of talking about generational themes, you see? So, like, if you go back to Paul's day back then, it was called political man. You identified with, so when Paul was in prison, right, and he talks to the guard, he's saying, don't you know that I am a Roman citizen? So then the Roman guard's like, whoa, okay.
Wait, we can't do this.
We can't do that. They're right. So that's political man. Then it changed to religious man. And how, like, then you start identifying with the church, and this is what I should be doing, this, which then fades to economic man, which is like, what do you do for a living? What that's how you identify with, is how are you going to provide for your family, which is founded on on the previous generation with religious man. So then it's like, after that, then is economic with how do you provide for your family, is like, are your family, is like, how are you running that? And then after that, now it's psychological. No, it's something. But like it phases. So now my generation is very much a relative truth kind of generation versus the previous generation, which wasn't a relative truth. So does that make sense?
Yeah. How's that applicable to this thing?
Okay. Well,
are you saying because each generation would like hear from a different vantage point? Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, I could see that. Like, well, one is I think we're very much living in a quote-unquote postmodern, post-truth world, right? Like, truth is relative. However, I think that's fading pretty fast because people are realizing, no, it's not. I mean, you can't live however you want and forego the consequences that come with violating God's moral law.
Right.
I mean, you can, but you could live however you want, but you jump off a 24-story building, there's consequences to those realities. So in light of that, I think, so having said all that, like, who do you think then is speaking to that today? I'll give you who I think is.
Okay.
I think Jordan Peterson is. Even though he's not, I wouldn't call him a Christian in the kind of, he's certainly not a Christian in the classical evangelical sense that you and I would say.
But he's challenging.
But he's speaking to he's disruptive. Very disruptive. And he's disruptive towards a vision of something that's greater than what we are right now.
I can see that. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, the point is this, like the larger point is, who are the prophets in your life?
Yeah.
And the temptation is to let the prophet find you versus you seeking out the voice of the prophet. Right? In a healthy system, you would want to check in with the prophet on a regular basis. Hey, where are we getting too comfortable? Hey, where are we letting our sorrows and disappointments overwhelm us? Hey, remind us of the vision of what God's called us to. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a rhythm that you want in your life. It's strong coffee, right? So this is not something that you probably want to drink every day.
No.
Because when they speak so ferociously. And not intended to be in a violent way or a destructive way, but in that disruptive way, that it's probably pretty... memorable. Okay, so you ready to move on? Or are you looking something up?
Well, that just reminded me, do you think, like, do you think Samuel was the prophet in Saul's life?
Yeah, well, Samuel is a prophet.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you look at the role of Samuel, and Samuel's the role for prophet, not just in Saul's life, but for all of Israel.
Right.
And he's going, before they even, hey, we want a king. You don't want a king. Here's why you don't want a king. They're going to tax you like everybody else. They're going to take your lands. You're going to have to pay taxes. You're going to have to be subjugated to them in different ways. They're going to take your young men and go to war. And people are like, that's fine. We still want all that. It's like, all right.
Here's Saul,
which was God's chosen. Right. Saul did.
So he anoints him, and he found him. Like, Saul wasn't looking for a prophet in his life. Yeah. Saul was finding his dad's donkeys.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's also another point. Is it like, in the event, I think it's healthier to invite the prophet into your life. But when the prophet finds you and disrupts you,
do not take offense.
That's the good word. Do not take offense. Because that's the temptation. I can't believe this person. Who do they think they are? You know what I mean? It's like, no, time out. This is God's actually, his grace being extended to you so that you can hear this. Because prophets, they are, they warn. That's one of their objectives, is to warn. Hey, you continue going down this road, or there's a road the Lord wants to have you on. Here's the road that he is placing you on. Okay, so the role one is who, the prophet. Who's the voice in your life that you allow to disrupt you? Second role.
The priest is a voice that connects me with others. If the prophet lays out a vision for God, who God is and how we ought to live, then the priest serves as the facilitator to guide us along the road. Do you think it's like a trade-off? Do you think it has like a specific order?
No, I don't think there's a specific order, but I would say that it's probably one way to think about it. I would say the priest is more in that kind of the way we would typically think of a pastor. And I don't mean pastor as in the guy who gets paid at church to preach on Sundays. Like, if that's your view of what a pastor is, you have a very limited capacity, right? But it's that person who is pastoring his sheep, his congregation into how do we then live these things out, right? It's the person that walks with folks through good times, hard times, regular times. You know what I mean?
Do you think the prophet tells and then the priest shows?
Possibly. Yeah, I mean, I think that if the priest is a facilitator, it's facilitating to a certain end. It used to be, I grew up in a church where we would do revival services once a year. And in some ways, the evangelist is kind of like that prophetic voice, right? So you would do these revival services where you would bring in an evangelist once a year to preach to the people for a week. And you'd show up every night at church, 7 p.m., sing 2 hymns, hear the sermon, altar call, or whatever. And I think in that kind of capacity, what you're doing is you're bringing in that disruptive voice that allows the preacher to pastor his people between revivals. Does that make sense? Like that kind of old school model, a way of doing church, it could serve that objective. Now, how many churches actually achieved that? I don't know. I pastored a church that was the case. How well I did that? Probably not very well, unfortunately. I would say if you're in a church and you're doing that, I think there's some models here to grab a hold of and maybe reinvigorate some ways of doing church with these kind of models in mind. Man, what if we thought about the evangelist as that prophetic voice that we're bringing in to disrupt us, and we let the people know this is what's going to happen. We're expecting this to happen. We want to gain a vision of what God has for us, and we want to be warned against some roads and thinking and living that we've adopted along the way. And then we're going to pastor effectively after that. Like, here's what it looks like afterwards. Right? So I think there might be a way to do something like that with those kind of roles in people's lives. What I find, though, is most people do not have that kind of pastoral connection in their lives because they're not either the way their churches are structured or their way they've chosen to allow that church to impact their lives affects to what extent they allow that kind of priestly pastoral voice in their lives. Because one of the things that the priest does, there's a variety of things, but one of them is like in Romans, Paul writes, it's for by grace that you have been saved through faith, this not of your own doing, it's the gift of God, not a result of works, so that anyone can boast. So it's that person that kind of walks with you through life when you're kind of starting to swell with pride a little bit and go like, hey, just a quick reminder. Remember, God's the big deal, not you. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's His grace that saved you. And I say that in love, and I say that because I saw how you kind of bragged a little more, and that testimony wasn't really a testimony. It was just a chance for you to talk about yourself. And do you know what I mean? It's that, and it's not a condemning voice.
No,
it's just a voice that comes along and says like, "Hey,
let's take it back.
I know these things about you. I see this in you." And so that's one of the things that there's another thing that does. You want to read that other piece?
Yeah, the priest draws the community of believers together through tradition and common ritual, so that they can have fellowship that is tightly bound through a common culture.
Yeah, so this is where, like in the Christian tradition, we would have baptisms and the Lord's Supper, right? Communion. Like doing those things on a regular basis, or even the way you kind of order your service or liturgy, like the way that's led.
Do you think that's becoming less and less popular?
What's that?
Like having fellowship with like sacred traditions?
Yes and no. I think we have traditions. The question is do they cultivate a common culture, or do they cultivate an individualistic culture? Right. And that's the role of the pastor or the priest, is to connect people with one another, not to serve up an individualistic
faith. I see that.
In fact, there's a book I read called The Missional Leadership. And one of the things they talk about in that book is how within your Christian community, in some way, it's not a particular person that does these things, prophet, priest, and king, as much as it is, they would say, I think one of the things they would argue is that it's Christian leadership's responsibility to allow those voices to rise up within the community. So it doesn't have to be the paid staff person who's doing these things.
Yeah.
It's the paid staff member's responsibility to make sure that these things are happening. Because one of the things I've seen is that some people are put into the role, the priestly role, but their gifting is more prophetic. And, people that have that prophetic gifting don't usually make for very good priests, because they kind of want to burn everything down. They don't want to walk with people, right? They're not inclined to walk. They probably would be inclined to be rather frustrated quickly, annoyed quickly. Why don't you see what I see? Like, and I'm not saying that justifies their actions and behaviors, but this is where, there's an importance in these kind of these distinct roles taking place within different communities. But your question about if that's fading today, I think if it's fading, it's because, one, some of it might be the nature of maybe some of the churches. Like the church we attend right now doesn't take communion regularly. Do baptism all the time, which is great. And I think they do that pretty well, all things considered. So So on the one hand, I think they do that really well. On the other hand, I don't think they do this other thing well. They do have some common cultural pieces. I think the important thing is to ask the question, and it's not just holding to cultural rituals and traditions for the purposes of ritual and tradition, right? It's we do these things because they remind us of who we are. They remind us of what we're to be about, right? Kind of going back to that.
Do not forget.
Yeah, that do not forget piece, right? Don't let these things fade. Why do we have to talk about this all the time? Because we don't want it to fade, right? Because if we don't talk about it all the time, we'll forget these things. There's also, one of their chief concerns is this culture this community where sin can be confessed, forgiveness is experienced, new converts are brought into the fellowship. That, the victors among us that are experiencing victory in their walk with Christ, they can share their testimonies, they can share their stories. Like those are the things that they're being mindful of. Like, how do we make sure that you're not living with unconfessed sin in your life? Scriptures tell us we're to confess our sins one to another. We don't do that in most Protestant traditions. And so as a result, a lot of people are either going living with unconfessed sin, or they're not being held accountable to sins that have become habitual in their lives.
Or they don't see it as important as it is.
Yeah. They undervalue.
Undervalue.
Yeah. The impact that it's having on their walk with God. Right? So the priest is the kind of the one that makes that, he's the one that makes sure that, that new converts are being welcomed into the fellowship, right? Paul addresses the early church where, you kind of had people that with money and without money gathering around for what they called the love feast, where they would gather in these meals. And, those that had wealth and money, they'd bring their own wine and their own fine meats, and they'd get drunk and party and things like that. And then those that didn't have much were kind of sidelined. And the role of the priest is to kind of go like, no, I think it was...
don't bring social status into this.
Yeah, well, they're the ones that check that social status, right? Because, and again, what did they remind everybody of? By grace you have been saved, right? This is the only reason why any of us are in this room right now.
It's because of this common thing.
Right. It's because of the work of Christ that dwells within us, right? So there's this fellowship then. How are we going to bring new converts into this community, and how are we going to make sure that those on-ramps are really shallow so that folks can get plugged in quickly and get plugged in well? And then how do we tell these stories? What has God been up to? And I think pastorally or in this kind of priestly, I'm using those terms synonymously, and I know a lot of people probably wouldn't, but I think for the purposes of this structure, I think it makes a lot of sense. That I think, are these the expectations I have of my pastor? Are these the expectations my community of faith has of their pastor? If not, then no, if I'm attending a church and the pastor is a program manager, okay, then that's their role. I'm going to have to find somebody else to have this voice in my life. And so what does that look like? Who are those folks going to be?
Yeah. Cool. Third one?
Thoughts? I feel like I'm doing lots of talking.
No, I agree. And I feel like priests are ones to sit down and check up on you a lot more. And kind of not from, I feel like prophets can kind of say, this is how it is. Take it.
Yeah, go, run.
You got this.
Make it happen.
Yeah. Now I'm going to go to someone else now and do that.
Yeah.
Versus priests are kind of okay, now that you know you have to do this.
Yeah.
How do I need to help you?
Yeah. Who do I need to connect with you with?
Yeah.
How can we help make sure that you don't stay in this spot?
I feel like that's kind of lost, especially with my generation. Especially maybe in my youth group, it's not as common to say,
yeah.
Okay, it says bear each other's burdens and walk with one another in love, and have God help you with that. And and again, kind of what you say, it's the thing maybe our church, but it's becoming more an individualistic faith more than a community faith.
Yes.
And so I feel
well, in this missional book I read, one of the things they talked about is so this is moving away from, they would say, viewing pastor as a psychotherapist or counselor, which leads to this very individualistic Christianity, right? So that's where you get your sermons of 7 steps to breaking your addictions. And it's, okay, great.
Why do you have these addictions?
Well, yeah. But then, it's okay, that's but it's did I get something out of the sermon today for me, right? That becomes the mantra. So when that kind of priestly role lives in that sort of capacity, that's you cultivate this at very individualistic faith. The other model is kind of pastor as CEO, entrepreneur, right? Lays out the programs, the strategies, what's the return on investments. We're leading organizations, we're leading structures, right? And it's not to say those two roles don't
intertwine.
Well, that they don't have a place, but it's that is not what this is, right? And this kind of priestly thing is no, we're here to cultivate a community culture around caring for the soul within the context of community, not just individualistically. So we're going to talk about Sabbath and not what Sabbath means to you versus what it means to me. We're going to talk about how could we do Sabbath together? How could we do fasting together? How could we learn to practice hospitality better with one another? That's the language that begins to be invited. And as a result of that, there's sort of the shift in that those sort of cultural norms that take place within that community. Okay, rule number 3.
Yeah.
So let's recap real quick. The rule number 1 is the prophet is a voice that disrupts my life. Rule number 2.
The priest is a voice that connects me with others.
Okay, rule number 3.
The king is a voice that establishes healthy boundaries. So while Christ is king of his church, he appoints regents who are charged on his behalf with maintaining healthy boundaries and ensuring there is margin for the priest, the prophet to execute their responsibilities.
Yeah, and so oftentimes people will view like prophet, priest, and king as like the one with all the power. Because we'll oftentimes look at these offices through that lens of power dynamics, which is not the lens that I want to invite people to take that lens off. It's not power dynamics. It's responsibility dynamics. It's what are you responsible for? So the king is not responsible for to tell everybody how things are supposed to be, right? That's not the king's responsibility. That's the prophet's responsibility. King isn't supposed to be the one that comes down and kind of walks with people in their misery and sorrow and helps them, find their footing and establishing the cultural norm. Nope, that's the priest's responsibility. The king's job, if you think about it in a context of like a physical kingdom, the king's job is sort of in and out responsibilities. Within the borders of my responsibility, my kingdom, within those borders, how are things?
And is everyone doing their job right?
Well, kind of, right?
Or they have to facilitate it.
Yeah, they're asking those kind of questions. Does everybody have access to food? Does everybody have clean water? How's sanitation going? They're walking through some of those organizational questions to remove the distractions that could take place within the life of the community, to get out those impediments that could bring the unhealthy things that could kind of rise up within it. They're going to address matters of justice, right?
Yeah. Hey,
this was right, that was wrong. They're going to kind of press into those areas. But they're so within the context of the community, they're looking at an infrastructure, right? What do we need to do internally to be the people God's called us to be? So then, if you think of that boundary, there's internal responsibilities, but then there's the external responsibilities, which, hey, there's real forces against us here. If we don't have these boundaries, the enemy's going to come against us. By establishing these boundaries, we know at least there's some margin between his efforts and our community. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And we're going to be able to identify where he's at, where that enemy may be attacking us. Do we have weaknesses in our boundaries where we're letting some things in we shouldn't be letting in? And we're going to call those things out. Are there places where there's the borders of our boundaries aren't clearly delineated, so our people are living in places they shouldn't be living? Do you know what I mean? They're living outside of that healthy infrastructure, and as a result, things are coming into the life of the community that shouldn't be there. So the king is that person. Again, it's not a position of power, and this is where I like that word regent. Have you ever heard of that word?
Oh my
regent?
gosh, yes. I go to a school called Regent. Believe it or not.
It's kind of it's that person that operates as if they were the king.
Yeah, they're like the stepping in until he comes back.
Yeah.
Typically for war, but
for
anything.
For all of these things, right? And so if you think back to Israel, and the most famous king is King David. When King David did well, it was because the enemies were being beaten. Israel was making their sacrifices as they should, according to the priestly order. And the prophet was able to speak what he needed. Do you know what I mean? It's like when you look at all three of these things are happening as they should be happening. And they should not be getting themselves into different swim lanes, right? So if you take King David, remember he wants to build the temple to the Lord, and God's like, nope, that's not your responsibility. You're a warring king. That's going to be something your son does, but that's not your job. And then David's like, okay, well, I want to bring at least the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem. And so they put it on a cart and start transporting it that way. Do you remember this story? And then the Ark of the Covenant starts to slide off the cart, and the guy reaches out and touches it, and he dies, right? Well, why is that? Because they aren't transporting it as God said it was to be transported, with these big, wooden rods that would go along the sides. And I think it was 6 men or 8 men would carry the Ark of the Covenant in, right? That's how it was intended to be carried. And so David is going like, here's something that should happen. And that's where he should have stopped and looked at the priestly order and said, I don't know how to do this. You guys make it happen. Right? He should have stopped there and said, it is right for us to bring this in. You guys, what do you need from me to make that happen? And the priestly order would have said like, well, this is how we're supposed to do it. This is what the law says. This is, do you know what I mean? That's like our swim lane. That's how we're supposed to do it. Remember, it was Nathan, the prophet, that came in and challenged David about his affair with Bathsheba. It was that voice of going like, you're the man who's not living as he should be living. So I don't want people to think that any one of these things is something to aspire to, right? Because that's the temptation. People are going to listen to this is like, oh, which one am I? Okay, that's not the question to be thinking about. The question to be thinking about is, who are these voices in my life?
Yeah.
So who am I listening to that can help?
Or who am I not listening to that I should be listening to?
Okay, yeah. Or that may be another way to frame it. Like, who should I be listening to that can help me better understand where my boundaries need to be? Because if I do not have healthy boundaries, then that infrastructure to how to order my life is not going to be what it ought to be. And I'm going to be exposed to threats. The inverse of that can be also true. Am I listening to voices that are leading me to draw unhealthy boundaries?
That's true.
Right? So, and this is where I would argue, pay attention to the music you're listening to, pay attention to the shows you're watching, whatever, social media feeds you're doom scrolling through. Like, what are these different voices in your life that are feeding a way of sort of thinking about how to order my life, where to put my expectations, that are feeding, in that prophetic sense, a sense of vision of what life could be, of how it's supposed to be. What are those things that are feeding in my life, a sense of care and concern and things in that kind of priestly pastoral way. So, the ideas with all these things is to kind of step back and go, what are those voices? And are they the voices God wants for me? And who are the voices I need to actually be listening to?
Who would you say in your life would be like an example of a king?
To rightly order things? It depends on what areas you're talking about.
That's
right?
true.
So like on the kind of like on the family dynamic thing of things, we listened to Focus on the Family back in the day. There was a guy by the name of Mark Gregston out of Texas that we listened to. There was a variety of like kind of those folks that said, hey, this is a good way to order your life. Dave Ramsey on how to order our finances. I'm trying to think who else. John Maxwell and some leadership stuff on how to kind of put your expectations in the right place. I'd have to look at my library, to be honest with you. today, who am I listening to? On that kind of rightly ordering things. That's a good question. And I don't know if I really thought, I'm like asking questions I'm asking myself right now, to be honest with you. Cause like for your mom and I, with you and your brother now being in college and you're not home, I mean, you're home right now, but you're not home all the time. It's giving us a chance to kind of reestablish some boundaries, right? Reestablish the order to some things. And so stuff that was applicable in the past is not necessarily applicable to us because we're not in that life stage anymore.
Yeah. How does it feel?
I mean, it's exciting. I think it's always fun to press into new seasons. And I think too, yeah, so there's that piece. On the priestly front, man, Henry Nouwen is amazing. I like the work John Mark Comer is doing right now, or the Practicing the Way folks. I met one of my cohort for the program I'm in. She writes for Practicing the Way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And in one of the classes I'm taking, met another guy who's he's written some stuff for practice, anyway. So it's been really fun to kind of get around some folks that are writing for these different areas. But, yeah, so I think like that's an example of some really good stuff. Anyway, and I'd have to look at my podcast list too. I think it's a really healthy exercise to kind of step back and go, okay, who could I be listening to in these different areas? And what does that look like? What are my needs now in those domains? But here's the thing, there's a book called a book called Leading with a Limp. And Dan Allender is the author of that book. And he writes this. He says, the king left alone will become a dictator who hates chaos. The priest on his own will fall into accommodation for the sake of avoiding conflict. And a prophet alone will indulge in drama or self-absorption for the sake of escaping boredom. They need one another to elude the trap of their own narcissism, which I thought was really good, because I think not only do those different roles need each other, but if I gravitate towards one of these at the expense of the others, then I'm going to give into my own narcissism as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I need those voices in my life. So forming that kind of triad, this is what I wrote in my paper, is like forming a triad of ministry voices who are distinctly qualified for a specific office and unified around an intensely clear vision, serve as a formative counsel for the cause of Christ and against the efforts of the evil one. Who would you say are your voices in those different areas?
3 areas?
Yeah.
I feel like all of them to some degree, or all of them are like mentors in some capacity.
Okay.
They're like guiding people
that
are like, here's how you should do it, because maybe they've seen it in their own life and they wanted you to press into the right things. I feel like there's different seasons of life where you and mom kind of evolve into these different areas depending on different things. Like as little kids, like you and mom are like the king, like
sure, setting the boundaries.
Yeah, setting the boundaries, but then also kind of like protecting us from outside stuff.
Sure.
When we knew it or we didn't know it.
Yep.
And then like as we've gotten older, you guys have definitely been prophets at times when you're like, we're not doing that. And now you know we're not doing that. Now you go figure out what you want to do now, but we're not doing that. And there's definitely been times when I've gone through seasons where you guys have walked me through stuff. I think now that I'm stepping into college, I feel like a lot of professors are going to be more prophets.
Sure.
Maybe one professor will be a priest in my life that I'm really excited about. Professor Bacon, if you're listening, it's you. I'm really hoping it's you. And especially go to a smaller university where there's like maybe max 30 kids in the class, where it's like, okay, that like now I'm one of 30. And I'm not a quiet student. Like, I like to give input. So I feel like a lot of them are going to be a prophet in some way, like academically or spiritually. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I feel like this can apply anywhere, but like specifically spiritually.
Yeah.
And I go to a Christian university, so like that kind of helps.
Those dots are easier to connect. Sure.
Yeah, but like, I mean, there's people in the church that that have been a priest and have walked me from junior year to now. Like Miss Deanna like knew me junior year, and she's been like pouring into me for like those 2 years of high school, and then now pouring into me as like a young adult. And I mean, it's our relationship has changed a little bit, but just kind of checking up and wanting to get coffee and wanting to just see what new life updates are happening. And then she always asks, like, how can I be praying for you? So like those are like physical things, I'd say.
People you
like
have close proximity to.
Right. Versus like, and I feel like the older you get, not that I'm saying you're old, but like.
But you are.
Okay. You're older than me.
That's true.
Then you start dipping into like, who do I need to be listening to on a podcast or in a book or.
Sure. I think you can do that when you're younger. I think the older you get, that you begin to live within frameworks a little bit more. And so you're able to kind of ask more specific questions about some aspects of life.
That's true.
Do you know what I mean? So it's the difference between, I need a screw to put this up. And it's like, okay, but what kind of screw and how long of a screw? And I mean, all of a sudden there's all these, it's like, oh, I didn't even know I needed to ask those questions. It's like, well, that's, depending on where you're out in the experience spectrum will shape some of those things. And so I think it could be similar with this, right? Like there's sets of questions people ask when they're a freshman an elite freshman.
My goodness.
An elite freshman in college that are different than the person who's, got a 10-year-old running around the house. Like they're asking different sets of questions, which means that prophetic voice is going to be different, that the concerns that the priest can come alongside and help guide, that where those boundaries are boundaries, but where the temptation would be to be lax in those boundaries are going to be, you're going to practice maintenance in other places, maybe a little bit more aggressively because of the wear and tear that takes place.
Yeah.
So, all right, good.
Good.
All right.
All right, good.
Any other thoughts there, kiddo?
I don't think so. Go Canadian. I don't know.
Hey, we're all coming to you, don't
Dad,
you know?
This is not good. This is not good. All right. You can share, follow, rate, and review this podcast. By doing that, it helps us gain traction and allows other people to hear us.
And know what to expect.
You can follow me or my dad on X at Milo Curtis.
X?
I am not. Should I get X? I don't know what I would put on it though. I feel like
I don't know what I put on it.
Yeah.
Links to the podcast.
Okay. You can follow me at olivia.grace_28 on Instagram or Olivia Curtis on Facebook. We do have a newsletter. You should come check it out.
Yeah, we're going to push out an episode here in the next week or two.
So. You can check that out at thisresilientsoul.com or email us at hello@thisresilientsoul.com in ways we can deepen the quality and expand the impact of this podcast. If so, you can put ideas in and give us input. We want all the input in the world. Yeah. We want you guys to have a great week. Thanks for listening.